Good morning. I'm Ellen Shoshkis, a faculty member in the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning at PSU, and I'm very happy to welcome you to Learning by Doing Streets for People. This is the inaugural event of the Portland Urban Design Collaborative. This initiative began to coalesce in the fall of 2019, when the deans of PSU's College of Urban and Public Affairs and College of the Arts charged a group of colleagues to explore the opportunity to convene an urban design collaborative. We proposed furthering this idea by hosting a series of public conversations on different facets of urban design. And we hope that this process of engaging folks from across the university, practitioners, advocates, and others in organizing these conversations would strengthen the connections between people, programs, and practices, and that the form of the collaborative and its agenda would emerge organically from this process. This first event focuses on public space and creative placemaking as a strategy that integrates arts and culture with community-based development and design. The pandemic, combined with the latest movements for racial justice, challenged conventional notions of how public space is designed and used. The crisis also raised awareness of the key role of public spaces as drivers of the recovery and the renewal of civic and economic life. With the availability of vaccines, it's time to plan for our recovery. What lessons can be learned from this past year's experimentation in Portland and elsewhere, with rapidly transforming streets to serve as public spaces for people to gather and businesses to operate? Today's conversation will identify issues and opportunities for policymakers, practitioners, advocates, and others to collaborate with faculty and students from PSO, PSU, U of O, and elsewhere on projects that explore new ideas based on these lessons learned. In April, we'll host workshops focused on these projects, and later in the spring, we'll reconvene to present the results of this work and to discuss the next steps of the Urban Design Collaborative. And I hope you'll join us. Now, I would like to introduce Professor Jennifer Dill, Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center at PSU, the co-host of this workshop. Jennifer?
Thank you very much, Ellen. TREC is really excited to co-host this event, and I appreciate the work that Ellen, Nick, and the organizing committee have put into it. TREC is an interdisciplinary center here at Portland State that supports collaborative research and education. And the focus of this virtual workshop really exemplifies the type of work that we do. Another example of that is Better Block PSU, which is a collaboration with Better Block PDX, which brings together our engineering and planning students from Portland State with community advocates to imagine what spaces could be when they are designed for people. We are in the process right now of soliciting new projects for that effort, and you'll hear a little bit more about that at the end of today's workshop. We hope some of you will participate. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Steve Percy, President of Portland State University. President Percy has dedicated his career to connecting universities and the communities that they serve. As PSU's president, he is prioritizing acting on equity and racial justice, student success, and engaging to strengthen our city. President Percy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to be able to join you and welcome you to this open public spaces, urban public spaces conversation. In recent years, we've been thinking a lot about resilience here at Portland State, and more specifically, how we respond to and come back from major challenges or disasters or crises. In that spirit, we've been spending a few years, and we just have launched this year a new graduate degree and a graduate certificate in emergency management and community resilience. And we'll be the first university in the country to have an emergency management program that's so focused on the notion of resilience, coming back, who's affected by disasters, how do we make sure everybody comes back equitably, and how we prepare for them. So delighted to that. And we must have had our timing right, because the COVID-19 pandemic arose just as we were finishing our planning and launching the degree, and it just showed us the import the ability to prepare for and respond to disaster. But resilience teaches us it's not only about response, it's also about coming back better, doing better, coming back in a way that's even stronger. And clearly the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our downtown community and its vibrancy in very important ways. And the idea of urban public spaces and their new use can certainly be a way of help bringing back downtown and our community. So I'm very pleased to have that conversation. I want to reaffirm to everybody that our commitment to mobilizing our resources at the university to serve the needs of the city as we envision and recreate our community is very strong. One of my 3 top priorities is to pivot and organize our community engagement expertise, experience, and commitment to helping rebuild a stronger and more vibrant and racially just community. So we're very pleased to know we're a partner, we're ready to be involved, and we want to be involved. I'm so delighted that this workshop and its follow-up will conduct hands-on workshops focused on projects we hope spur resilient response. So far, these projects include TREC's current RFP for a better Block Portland, which we just heard about, and existing safe routes to school at Cesar Chavez Elementary School being studied by the Civil Engineering Capstone, projects being studied by 2 MERP, Massive Urban Regional Planning workshops that are going on. So there are a variety of different things going on in this area, and to pull them together, bring attention, and more specifically to bring in community partners to help us think, plan, and then participate in implementation is so important. We're also hope to spur the reactivation of sites on our own campus in anticipation of the reopening this fall of our campus. We're committed to a program, Open Fall, Open for All, which we hope to stimulate people coming back to college and being involved in campus. While we'll still have a vibrant online program as we've had, we want to get back to campus-based learning and support our students in that and their academic achievement. This is our PSU's 75th anniversary. Our early history started with crisis as the flooding of our Vanport campus and coming back. So resilience is kind of part of our spirit. I very much look forward to the dialogue and the good thinking. I want to thank Deans Cy Adler and Leroy Bynum for their work in creating this urban design collaborative. And this is a wonderful example of that work today. So thank you all for being here. This is really important and I think very exciting and helps bring us a lift to exciting ideas at this time when there's so much that kind of can bring us down. So I look forward to the positive and energy and spirit today. Next, it's my great honor to introduce and welcome Commissioner Joanne Hardesty. Commissioner Hardesty oversees the Portland Bureau of Transportation, along with the Portland Fire and Rescue and the Office of Community and Civic Life. She previously served as president of the NAACP Portland branch, and she served in the Oregon State Legislature as part of a very long career of public service and advocacy. Welcome, Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you so much, President Percy. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. And I want to also thank this gathering of big thinkers that are coming together today to think outside of the boxes we all normally operate in. As a new commissioner in charge of transportation, the Bureau of Transportation, I will tell you, I'm already thinking about how do we create what we used to call 20-minute walking neighborhoods and communities, right? What is the big thinking that we can come into as we start rebuilding, coming out of this pandemic, that will lead us to the future that we want? And for me, everything that I'm doing is through a lens of climate and racial justice. If we don't change how we use automobiles in this city, we will continue to have the fossil fuel that is damaging our climate, damaging our communities, and damaging our ability to really move to a more multiple modal transportation options. So I'm looking at, just so I can tease you, I'm looking at developing an international district downtown. Right? Anybody that's been in New York or any other major city, you know that cultural districts really make a community thrive because people can walk from one place to the next and have a different cultural experience. I'm also looking at how we can make some streets downtown car-free, and not just downtown, but in other parts of the city of Portland. We need areas in the city that the community meets as community meeting spots. And we don't have enough of those today. what I know about this convening today is that you're going to be thinking big about what's possible for the future. And I will ask you, as you do your work today, as you continue with this cohort to be thinking big, I encourage you think big and think about where we're moving. Don't think about where we've been, because honestly, I don't want to like invest dollars in things that are things from the past. And in my mind, freeways are things from the past. So I need your help. I want you to come back with big ideas, big visions. Don't worry about what it costs, because we'll figure out how to pay for it, right? If it's the right vision, we will figure out how to make it work. But I need your help, because I need people that are not bogged down in a way we've always done things to be able to imagine what's possible. I thank you for allowing me to come today and meet with you before you get to the hard work. I also want you to know that I am open. You may have ideas that will come out of your work that I haven't even imagined yet. And that's what I'm looking for. I need you. I need your best thinking. And I need you to imagine, what does Portland look like 20 years from now? What looks different 20 years from now for Portland that you have had a hand in starting today? Thank you for the invite. I look forward to the partnership, and I look forward to the creativity that you will bring to what's next as we rebuild a more equitable, a more inclusive, and a more transparent community where everyone gets to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, President Percy, Professors Jennifer Dill and Ellen Shoshkis for kicking us off. My name is Nick Falbo. I'm a transportation planner at the City of Portland Bureau of Transportation, also known as PBOT. Today, I'll guide us through a series of compelling presentations and discussions on creating streets for people. Yes. Let me share my screen real quick. Today's presentation and discussion focuses on the active and ongoing adaptive reuse of our streets. We've seen changes on our streets today as a response to pandemic safety guidelines, and we can imagine our streets tomorrow as a platform to enrich our lives and our communities. In today's presentation, we'll hear from PBOT planner Mike Saratella about the Healthy Businesses Permit Program and our COVID street adaptation strategy, followed by PBOT Planning Group Manager Art Pierce about the future opportunities our streets can offer. If there's time, we'll do a brief Q&A in response to the presentations. But the bulk of the workshop will be spent with you, the participants, in breakout groups designed to touch on the sticking points of creating and adapting these new public spaces. We'll wrap up with a roundtable of our facilitators to share the group discussion and reflect on what struck them the most about the conversation. And we'll leave you with opportunities to get involved in student and community projects, as well as how you can connect with the Urban Design Collaborative effort. So let's get to it. During our presentations, feel free to ask questions in the chat window for the Q&A. I want you to please welcome Mike Saratella to share lessons from PBOT's Healthy Businesses Permit Program.
Thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone. Can everyone see my screen okay, Nick? Great.
We can see your PowerPoint. There we go.
Awesome. Okay, well, yeah, thank you again to Dr. Shoshkis, Dr. Dill, President Percy, Commissioner Hardesty, and Nick for framing up what I am hopeful will be a really fruitful, inspired, and dynamic conversation today. So my name is Mike Saratella. I'm a transportation planner with the Area and Project Planning team at PBOT. And I've been fortunate enough to be very close to our COVID response work, which includes our Healthy Businesses program, which I'll be kind of focusing on today. So I'm going to be giving kind of a boilerplate presentation, providing a little bit of background about our COVID response strategy and kind of how it came to be, an origin story, if you will. Some reflections about hurdles and lessons learned along the way as we work towards implementation in the summer of 2020 to today. I'll do a kind of a deep dive into a case study that is kind of very near and dear to my heart. That really centers on the importance of activation, programming, and the kind of expanded role our streets as public spaces could play in the social and public life of our city. And I'll close with just some general thoughts to help kind of seed our bigger conversation later in the second half of the presentation. So yes, I just want to say thank you to the hundreds of you out there who signed up and are participating with us today. I'm thrilled to be here, and I hope you are too. So our story begins about a year ago this week, actually, in a distant galaxy known as March 2020. COVID, as we all remember, a year ago moved quickly and it overtook us with an unprecedented degree of change and uncertainty during that month of March. In the span of a couple of weeks, we moved from having our first case in the state of Oregon, followed by a nationwide spike, to quickly learning about new things like social distancing, precautions leading to, and closing of schools and public buildings, and a statewide stay-at-home order. The brisk pace of change was really kind of an unprecedented challenge and put us in a difficult place about thinking about how to respond in the moment, but also what the future would hold. If you remember back to those early days, reading the headlines, reading the kind of news was really overwhelming, and it left us at PBOT with a really strong sense of urgency about how to adapt and respond to this crisis in a meaningful way. During those first months, we operated with limited information about risk and the scale and duration of the pandemic. And we were seeing kind of unprecedented economic and disparate impacts posed by the crisis. I don't think any of us a year ago could imagine the kind of scale of human health, emotional, and economic impacts that this pandemic would have on our city, our community, our state, and our country. Our team, kind of spurred into action by these challenges, began initial conversations, which led to some rough ideas, which led to some presentations and bigger conversations throughout the Bureau. And as it turned out, the more we talked to people, the more that there was a growing community of planners and PBOT employees and public employees and community members trying to wrap their heads around ways that we could adapt our streets and our existing programs to support Portlanders in this time of need. We looked for inspiration to a global community of urbanists, planners, architects, designers, activists, and for ideas about how we could adapt and respond our normal work programs and our investments to respond to this crisis. So we borrowed and stole and shared all that we could. Some of the ideas in these initial weeks focused on kind of meeting the immediate needs of Portlanders struggling with basic needs like food security and transitioning to an at-home learning environment for K-12 students. Others looked ahead just to a future kind of past the horizon of the immediate pandemic stay-at-home order, where we would have to find ways to live alongside each other with the kind of ongoing public health threat posed by COVID. And some other ideas like really kind of looked to that post-pandemic future with an idea of recovering not to the world that we left behind in March 2020, but to a world that was more just, more equitable, and more resilient. These ideas coalesced into an action plan, a strategy called the Safe Streets Initiative, which is a collection of over 60 strategies aimed at supporting the social, physical, economic, and public health life of the city of Portland. The Safe Streets Initiative is built around a framework that considers how the actions we take today to address the kind of immediate challenges should not only focus on those challenges, but also look ahead and seek to address long-standing racial, economic, and environmental justice issues and put us on a trajectory towards a more resilient future. So a quick overview, so the kind of framework is kind of built into these four kind of interconnected and overlapping phases or waves of change as we describe them. So if back in the initial days of the pandemic, we were living under a stay-at-home order. So how does the Transportation Bureau, which is mostly focused on moving people in and around places to kind of adapt its kind of main charge to support people in their times at home. The next kind of phase, this is kind of where we're at today. was how to adapt and respond our streets to support physical distancing. So on streets that were just really not meant to and designed to do that. Later stages focus we can kind of see this window in later this year as the vaccine rolls out, about how can we set ourselves up for kind of a robust and just and more equitable economic recovery and reinvestment and reactivation of our public spaces and civic life. And all of these considerations, how do they align and get us to a better endpoint, a better future? So here we are. We're in a kind of inflection point where vaccine accessibility is becoming more and more widely available. And we have our eyes kind of simultaneously on maintaining kind of safe physical distancing on our streets and public spaces, while also looking more towards economic recovery, reactivation of our central city and other main streets, and reinvestment in our communities. The Safe Streets Initiative is really a kind of a broad umbrella program, but the kind of more kind of higher profile, more visible elements really focused on our ability to adapt our streets to respond to the challenges of physical distancing. Within that, there are kind of three main program areas that you may have seen. Our Slow Streets program, which kind of expanded our existing neighborhood greenway into a 100-mile network of low traffic, calm streets to expand access to basic mobility by walking, biking, and rolling. Our Safer Busy Streets program, which invested in quick deployment of wider areas for walking, waiting at intersections, and accessing transit on our busy arterials in East Portland, where sidewalk constraints kind of limit abilities for people to safely physical distance. And of course, our Healthy Businesses program, which is kind of most relevant to our talk today, focused on transforming our streets, sidewalks, and main streets into kind of human-centered spaces for outdoor commerce, activity, and social connection. So a little bit about our Healthy Businesses program. So this program launched in May 2020 and has gone through a number of renewals as we continue to live with the challenge of physical distancing. In its essence, the program built off our existing Portland in the Streets program to offer a new streamlined and free permitting process to quickly create new space for people to safely operate outside in where transmission risk was lower. The program offered kind of a range of different menu options that businesses and community-based organizations could choose from, kind of depending on their need and the context of the street that they were operating in. These included kind of smaller interventions like parking plazas, kind of a variety of scale of street plazas and car-free areas, and also included things like short-term pickup and drop-off to help support curbside commerce. Overall, throughout the kind of period between May and October over the summer of 2020, we witnessed nearly 700 healthy business permit applications throughout the city of Portland. It's kind of unbelievable. If you would have told me in March that we would be creating, kind of scaling up this program at this scale, I would have been kind of shocked, honestly. So kudos to our permitting team for handling all of that. That was quite a challenge. We've witnessed a lot of these kind of permits and plazas and car-free areas of our cities really clustered around our central city and our kind of established historic neighborhood main street areas. The kind of by far the most common adaptation of our public spaces and our rights of way were in the form of parking plazas, which were kind of simple, lower lift ways for businesses to expand their presence into the street. It was really exciting over the summer of 2020 to watch different restaurants and businesses kind of iterate, expand, and learn from one another and exchange best practices as we saw these plazas, these kind of parking plazas pop up all over town. Many of our applicants, though, did decide to kind of go for a larger transformational change, and pursued street plazas kind of all throughout the city. I believe that we issued over 50 kind of street plaza permits, and this really kind of seeds our conversation today. So I have here a picture of kind of 3 of some of our most well-loved and well-used plazas. One at Southeast Ankeny, right off 28th Avenue. One at Clinton Street at 26th, and that kind of commercial node there. And an example of one of 2 kind of side street plazas set up by Stormbreaker directly off Main Streets. This one's from Mississippi, but they also have another one on North Lombard in St. John's. I chose these 3 examples because these 3 kind of share common characteristics, which I believe really kind of led to their success. One is that they create kind of intimate human scaled spaces. These are relatively small, comfortable spaces for people to be in. They are fronted by neighboring businesses that were all kind of participating and engaged in activation. These side streets aren't on the main busy thoroughfare that carries the big, the kind of major transit access and all that. These are streets that kind of are directly right off of those areas. So they were able to, in many ways, kind of meet the need for expanded public space without carrying some of the kind of bigger, thornier impacts around moving transit and things like that. They're well served by our bike and ped network. And as I mentioned, there was kind of a strong community support and leadership in the activation and programming. These particular plazas kind of stand out to me as kind of the right size for a pilot. And we were able to learn a lot of good lessons from them. If you remember early on in the pandemic, there was a big discussion about potentially closing off major main streets throughout the city to open them up for kind of series of car-free areas. And we felt that, or when we asked community about these ideas, we often heard that the scale of change and the uncertainty of the world that folks were operating in was too large to make such a drastic transformation. Planning during an unprecedented global pandemic is difficult. It involves kind of balancing a desire on our part to move quickly and take action to respond to this crisis, but while also kind of making space for community to kind of shape these spaces and take ownership over them. So as I mentioned, like concerns about moving transit, kind of evolving public health guidance around what was safe, what wasn't, and kind of community expressed kind of concerns around access to kind of important destinations on kind of these major streets, made us realize that while there was a lot of interest in these kind of multi-block main street closures, that many members of our community just weren't really ready to ask and discuss those questions, given the kind of world of uncertainty that our small business community and our most impacted communities were experiencing. But nonetheless, these smaller scale interventions kind of sprinkled throughout the city provided a really great kind of pilot for us to learn about the kind of strengths and pitfalls of these kind of pop-up plazas. So kind of some just basic takeaways are starting small and building up. So a small success leads to other successes. A good idea is liable to grow in scale and impact. Start with kind of lower cost and temporary materials first. You can always upgrade and build as the kind of space grows and activates. And those kind of takeaways really kind of help guide us as we think about another summer of street transformation in public space. Overall, our Healthy Businesses program has been kind of very popular and very successful. When we've asked people about whether they would like us to expand or do more of these spaces, the vast majority of Portlanders encourage us to do more and to kind of seek a permanent pipeline for these. So while the kind of need for physical distancing may be not with us indefinitely, seems to be an interest, and we're really excited about the kind of broad community support for doing more of this type of work in our communities. as I mentioned earlier, kind of the predominant kind of clusters of these permits and these activation spaces were in our kind of central city and historic main streets. And as we watched the permits rapidly come in June and July of 2020, we noticed kind of an opportunity to expand the reach and access of our program into kind of higher equity areas of the city, such as like East Portland, the kind of MLK corridor in historic Albina, and in lower Southeast. And so while over 20% of our permit holders on the onset of the program were owned by BIPOC-owned businesses, we saw opportunities to kind of expand and adapt the program to better meet those needs, especially in, like I mentioned, in East Portland and in the Black-owned business districts along MLK to support kind of their use of public space and micro enterprise in that historic Albina area. We wanted to make sure that the benefits of this program didn't just acquire or accrue to those who came into the situation with resources and bandwidth to participate, but that we could help as a city concerned with racial and economic equity to kind of intervene and engage and adapt our program to better meet those goals. So yeah, here are the kind of areas where we saw opportunities to adapt and expand the program. In order to kind of narrow this gap, we leaned on a program called the Frontline Communities Partnership, which was stood up kind of alongside the Safe Streets Initiative by our former equity director, Irene Marion. We miss you, Irene. The program developed dozens of partnerships with community-based organizations throughout the city to strengthen our equity lens, our outreach, and our ability to connect with our city's most vulnerable community members. While these partnerships kind of revolve broadly in our COVID response work, a handful of them were very close to our Healthy Businesses program. And I'll be kind of diving into a case study briefly about a particular project in partnership with the Seoul District Business Association, which represents kind of the historic Albina area and is focused really on the MLK corridor. One other quick reflection here is that having these partnerships really allowed us to meet our equity goals that were central to our Safe Streets initiative. And so many of these relationships were kind of built through the implementation of the program. And so moving forward, we want to make sure that we maintain, expand, and really kind of deepen our connection with these trusted community-based organizations so that when we're faced with the next challenge, the next pandemic, the next resiliency challenge, we have these kind of partnerships ready to go. The kind of gap in representation in the Healthy Businesses program was a major kind of revealed a major opportunity for us to think differently about what our role as the city, as a permitter of public space was in creating new spaces and helping activate them. Around this time, a new opportunity emerged through NACTO for a small grant to kind of support our Safe Streets program through their Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery program. So we applied in partnership with the Seoul District Business Association to expand our Frontline Community Partnership with them to focus on kind of three elements. One would be to expand our kind of reach and the depth of our community engagement around healthy businesses in the MLK corridor, to invest in district-wide placemaking to support the kind of immediate needs of that street, but also with an eye towards the future in terms of activating and supporting kind of a Black-centered business district, and to expand kind of in the summer of 2020, the presence of our Healthy Businesses program in historic Albina, one to support the businesses in that corridor on MLK, but also to create spaces for micro enterprise and community connection in that important neighborhood. So over the summer and fall of 2020, I had the kind of opportunity to engage in kind of deep partnership with community members and business owners and community-based organizations in this corridor, which led to kind of an opportunity to activate a side street plaza off Northeast MLK Jr. Boulevard at Northeast Sumner, called Dream Street Plaza. This idea was not my own idea. This idea was the intersection of kind of an identified need that we expressed, along with kind of on the ground organizing and activation by members of the community, most notably Cole Reed, owner of Greenhouse Gallery. If you haven't been to Greenhouse Gallery, I highly recommend paying a visit. It is a special, unique, and powerful space in the city of Portland. We partnered deeply with Soul District, Greenhouse, and the other neighboring businesses, including Old Town Brewery and Champions Barbershop, to stand up a kind of major side street plaza in the fall of 2020 on this street. We hosted 5 events over a period of 5 weekends, featuring over 20 BIPOC vendors, microenterprise, artists, makers, people selling food, selling clothing, and creating a space for community to come together to reconnect in a way that was safe, affirming, and centered kind of our kind of dual focus on racial and economic recovery in the area. With changing kind of COVID guidance and a surge of cases in the kind of later half of the fall of 2020, we have kind of paused programming at that space, but it was a important, powerful case study in kind of deep partnership and engagement and kind of activation of spaces to support microenterprise, to support social distancing, to support community connection. So here's a couple quick pictures. So we started off with kind of a small parklet right outside of Old Town Brewing. The street is open here. And we were able to bring in a street mural, trees, plants, tents, other elements funded through that grant to help activate that space. Showing up with material resources was huge in getting things started. But as I'll touch on later, the kind of ongoing stewardship and programming is essential to the kind of enduring qualities of these spaces. So here's another picture here of the street before it was closed. And here's kind of showing that transformation on our opening day. This space was much more than just about tents or tables or kind of physical elements. If you stood in the square in October of 2020, it was full of laughter, of joy, of music, of people who hadn't seen each other in months safely connecting in an affirming public space. It was, there's so many lessons learned, and I'll share a couple of takeaways from this project with you. This project really kind of highlighted the need for us to think beyond permitting public space, that the city has a role in connecting with people, building relationships, and expanding our partnerships in pursuit of activating public spaces. That doesn't mean that PBOT has to be in charge of activation and programming, but it means that we need to look at the context, not just the physical context, but the kind of broader context of a space and figure out how we can help support, whether we lead from behind, or whether we're just there showing up and engaged in kind of a plan for activation and programming. For kind of building off that is that bringing resources to the table can be a catalyst, can mitigate risk, especially in times of uncertainty. But ongoing plans for maintenance and stewardship are essential for these spaces to kind of stay active and stay engaged. So the most beautiful designed public space, if it doesn't have that kind of human software element of programming and activation, will not be a successful space. So thinking both about the built environment, but also the kind of social and community environment. We found that in this space, smaller streets with active frontages make for really great plaza environments. So wider streets, bigger streets, busier streets, you know, they're very large And humans like to feel kind of cozy and comfortable in a space. Now, this is particularly challenging with COVID, of course, but as we look towards a post-pandemic future around public space activation, thinking about creating these kind of intimate, special, unique spaces really help give an identity to that, to these these plazas. And then lastly, really, our streets are flexible, dynamic public spaces that can support a wide range of uses and purposes. So as we've seen these plazas pop up and blossom all over the city, different ones serve different purposes. Some are focused primarily on outdoor dining and food and creating spaces for people to connect over meals. Some spaces have been successful as kind of spaces for micro enterprise to blossom, for activism to happen. So we should think beyond the kind of most predominant kind of use of these spaces as expansions of businesses and think about a broader kind of use and programming element of how to activate public space in our city. And stepping back and kind of closing out, kind of some bigger takeaways kind of from a year of experimentation, kind of a response, emergency response, looking back on it as sort of a pilot for what lies ahead. So I just want to share these and then I'll be passing it to Art. So one is that we should lead with kind of low impact but useful interventions. Sometimes going after the kind of getting things started quicker on the ground and building from there kind of gets us to where we want to go faster than spinning our wheels, trying to conceive of a major first step. Kind of in that same vein, start with flexible materials, picnic tables, planters, umbrellas, quick items that can be easily deployed to kind of test out a space, make adjustments, and then scale up from there in terms of the investment level and permanence. Build dynamic feedback loops for community engagement. So this is both in the broader public, but also kind of at that micro level around business engagement, around stakeholder engagement in those who are kind of most engaged in that space. And then building on that, sort of be clear and transparent about how you adapt and respond to what you hear from the public. We've brought in plazas, we've removed plazas, we've adjusted plazas to meet those needs. And that's part of a trust building exercise that kind of is essential to the kind of pilot nature of this work. Build on plans and programs and adopted policies. You know, one of the successes of this program is that we were able to take our kind of robust Portland in the Streets program and supercharge it and expand the kind of impact that we could have around reimagining our streets and our public spaces. Starting that from scratch on this quick of a timeline would have proved nearly impossible. And lastly, just thinking more and more, I can't emphasize enough that programming and stewardship are key to sustaining these public spaces. So it's beyond just the initial activation, but kind of if we want these spaces to be with us and with us in a more permanent way, how do we set ourselves up to have them be active, engaged, and well loved and well cared for? And kind of just closing out, just thinking about our framework, thinking about words shared by Commissioner Hardesty at the beginning of this talk. Let's keep the future in mind about what we're building and who we're building for while we meet the needs of today. The steps that we take, the kind of experiments that we make on the ground in the next year, coming years, can set us on a trajectory towards a really meaningful and powerful transformation of our public spaces. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Art, and I look forward to engaging with you all in the breakout discussions. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Mike. That was a tremendous story you walked us through, and it just brought me back to what a year we have had, both in terms of the challenges and the opportunities. And so, you know, a couple sort of, you know, I think I'm jumping in as sort of the pivot to where are we going to go from here? Well, what does this take us to? And I think, you know, one of the key takeaways already that hopefully you're gathering with us is we realized as a city and as a community and as a business community that we could do this. We could do something that was hard and seemingly impossible in previous eras through enduring and pivoting in a crisis to show that there's a possibility for more and varied uses for our streets. And so, really sort of proud of the team and at what we were able to do. And I think in particular, really big kudos go out to the team that did the permitting and evaluation of these locations, the people in the streets team that were able to nimbly adapt and provide a level of customer service and a level of care and feeding to these sort of intimate business conversations about where are you going to take your business as it's struggling to the next level. And so it's been so great to see. And I think it's an example of how we can pivot our services more broadly to be responsive and encouraging of adaptive uses. So, where do we go from here? So if in the last year, let's see if I can, there we go. If in the last year we found ourselves in the streets with some new uses and we have all the lessons and examples that Mike walked us through, I think the big question is, what does this tell us? We're heading into a new summer. I actually think this is going to be kind of the summer that tells us this trajectory. What we do over the next 6 months is going to give us an understanding of the lasting benefit of these types of uses. How do we mix the possibilities of business use in the right of way with non-commerce driven public use of these spaces to really create welcoming and inspiring spaces. So, I think it's important to recall that, streets are one of our largest public resources. In fact, in the central city and in much of the area, it makes up 40% of our land area. So you think about, the creation of a new park versus the creation of multiple new street plazas, the possibilities are just much greater for success and cost efficiency if we're able to think about street spaces differently and incorporate them into this strategy. There we go. And I think this is somewhat unique to Portland. Portland has a different street grid than other sort of similar sized cities that really gives us the possibility to think about that we might be able to adapt some streets while leaving other streets open to traffic to create this possibility. And so I think we're maybe more ripe for this conversation than a lot of locations. So as we're heading into these workshops, I sort of leave you with some questions. What if instead of a street looking like this is Park Avenue in Southwest, what if we were thinking about that street looking like this as a place for community, or that street as a place for play, recreation and exercise, or spaces for families to gather and for children to play, or as spaces for gathering where we're using this as a way of strengthening and creating the ties of community of adjacent residents to come out of their homes and connect together and find shared connection. And I think this is also a key moment for us, through the learnings of the last year in particular of, what is the role of public space in our centering around equity, in creating intentional spaces that can really be responsive to our goals and exemplify our goals, and an opportunity to not have public space be an opportunity for the sanitation of space but instead for this space that can be sort of celebrating all of the ways in which all of the Portlanders together make this great city. And I think that's particularly true in the central city where we have not created as strong of those opportunities. I really loved the commissioner's comments about the idea of international districts in the central city, starting to create some re-neighborhooding of the central city areas where there's some specific identities and connections that happen in those areas. This is not without challenges, and this is why we wanted to start a sort of broad and open conversation like we're having with all of you here today. The long-term programmatic considerations that are ahead of us are evidence of why we haven't done this before, but also of why we need a really intentional series of steps forward over the next year to overcome these challenges. Whose spaces are these? Which agencies might be the ones that are overseeing their curation and their management? who takes out the trash? All of those things, when you get down to the details, really get hard and get really important. And so thinking about what is the infrastructure change is really just a part of the puzzle. We need to be thinking about the long-term funding and curation costs of this space, how we are understanding how this is adapting current parking supply and bringing it to adjacent locations to make sure we're still providing access. And I think, very centrally right now, how does this relate to the crisis we're in terms of houselessness, and how do we make sure that we're sort of adapting in a just and equitable way through that process? This isn't a new conversation. I both am sort of proud that we've been talking about this from the 70s, but I'm also pretty embarrassed, honestly, that since the 1950s or 1970s and the 1972 plan, and even before that, we had a vision for, at least in the central city, a series of car-free areas. And so I think many of the areas that we'll be talking about in the near term for the central city will echo these same locations. And so it's not a new idea, but it's an idea that needs a new set of energy and a new set of deliberation to really have us overcome those barriers and challenges. We do have some existing locations in the central city that match up with where it was articulated in that 1972 plan. And so we do have examples of spaces that are successful and are well curated. When we have examples on this map that weren't intentionally curated adequately and are leaving us with additional challenges of unintended functions occurring in those spaces. Portland's transportation system plan, looking out to, at this point, 15 years, but at the time it was 20 years, also saw this as a key move for Portland, and includes policy objectives directing us to look at streets as public spaces and looking at how we can repurpose street space specifically to enable these new functions. So we've got plans that have our back in this conversation. And I think, very, very excitingly, while we had been working on this with some deliberation in recent years, we have a new commissioner who sees the benefit of this and is really driving us as a bureau to respond to this as an idea, and directing us to look with sort of all due haste and deliberation on how we can move this forward. And that's just very, very exciting. And we really are super excited for her leadership in this conversation. So as we head into the next phase of conversation, I want to make sure that you understand this is the beginning or the middle of a journey. This is not the end of the journey. And that's why we wanted to have this conversation sort of in this open-ended context. We need your help to understand how we can think about these spaces to make sure that they are supportive of adjacent businesses, responsive to community needs, helping us to adapt spaces that can be successful, that can lift up a whole variety of uses and functions, and really center ourselves on an equitable and just outcome for Portland. So together we'll continue to learn. We will have successes, we will make mistakes, and hopefully we'll learn from those and continue to adapt as we're driving the conversation forward. So thank you. I'm really excited that you're all here and have such a great response to this session.
Thank you, Art. Thank you, Mike, for the great presentations on the work that we're doing and maybe the direction that we can go in the future. We've got a lot of questions in the chat. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I do want to ask a couple questions, throw a couple your way. Just 2 or 3 if we can. A question for Mike. There are a handful of questions in the chat, just sort of about the Healthy Businesses program in general, about sort of what's the process for getting one of these plazas? What are the resources that are being offered? Like, what's our position as a city? What are we offering up? And what about things like barricades, bollards, tables, chairs? Is that on the applicant or is that on the city? Just a quick rundown.
Great. So the application is still up on our website. So if you go to our Safe Streets Initiative website, which I think maybe I'll just throw a link in the chat, you can apply for a permit. Parking permit is kind of the easiest, lowest lift one, something we can approve really quickly. The street plazas, the side street plazas, the ones that I've seen be most successful kind of are a collaboration between multiple stakeholders. And they have some level of community buy-in that says, we want this, we're excited to have this street opened up for other uses. In terms of materials and resources, at the end of last year, we were able to acquire kind of a library, a lending library of traffic control devices, things like planters, barricades, and different things like that to help secure those spaces. And so we have those available for lending and for deployment as needed. There's opportunities to have trees delivered to the space through a partnership with BES. And in terms of furniture and resources and tables and things like that, we were able to kind of pilot a Plaza Kits program at the end of last year, which provided kind of a starter kit of kind of the most essential elements of these plazas to 20 BIPOC-owned businesses throughout the city. And so that was a great learning experience for us. And it's something that we have our eye towards expanding this summer and kind of in the future. Art, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure. I think this is part of the conversation today, actually, is, what is the role of PBOT, and how do we fit into this? We are the keeper of these streets, but we are really in response to public need. That is what we're here for. And so, I think it's a challenge for us overall. We can't resource all the ideas that will come out, so we're going to have to be strategic in where we go. But I think I want us to be an active player. We're looking at acquiring some planters and things like that that might be able to supplement some of these shared spaces that are beyond what an individual business would use, but might be the shared space that is harder for an individual business to curate. So that's probably the place where I can immediately see us being most active. But I think that's part of the feedback loop that we want to make sure is active and happening here.
Thanks, Art. Thanks, Mike. Art, I've got a little bit more of a critical question for you.
Sure.
This is a question about, whose safety does this program seek to improve on the streets? There's a lot of discussion today about an emphasis on businesses,
right,
as a primary kind of applicant. How do we pivot this program, or what can we do so it can support people and communities in need, not just the economy?
I love that question. Yeah, I think that is the next sort of phase. I don't know if you noticed from the slides that I was sharing, sharing slides that are really uncommercial spaces, non-commercial spaces that are less curated. And I think that's a sort of key question that we're deliberating with this conversation today and heading forward, is how can we help in partnership with community curate spaces that really are lift up all sorts of Portlanders and give them welcome to those spaces. And I think that's sort of a fundamental challenge, is who takes care of those spaces then? Is that the Parks Bureau? Is that PBOT? Is that a business organization? Is that a community organization? And so we've seen examples from all over the country and world where there's sort of business models for how these come together. And we don't have those business models currently fully functioning here in Portland. And so it's I think it's a key question. The intention of this program would be that it is beyond just specific support for business use in the right of way, and is able to bring in community uses in the right of way more generally. And that is exactly what we need everyone's help on, is charting a good path forward with doing that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Art, for taking on that question. I want to make sure we can keep us on track and just give us time for our breakout discussions. Many of these questions that have come up in the chat, and even those that have been raised by our speakers, are the topic at hand today. So I'm hoping that we can dig in detail into these topics and these questions in those group discussions. So we have 5 breakout groups for you to choose from today. I'm going to share my screen and load up that selection. So we've got 5 breakout groups for you to choose from today. They're each designed to address some of the challenges and opportunities that you just heard about. These are shown here on the left. And of course, while equity is a topic in every one of these breakout groups, if you want to dig in deep, join Breakout Group 1, Equity and Inclusion in Public Space, facilitated by PSU Professor Julius McGee. This group will recognize that public space isn't always welcoming and that people are not always welcomed. You'll discuss the ways to seek justice and resist white supremacy in public space. Group 2 is Designing Places to Gather, facilitated by Todd Ferry, the Associate Director of the PSU Center for Public Interest Design. This group will discuss considerations for creating year-round, multi-purpose public spaces and designs for compatibility with transit, walking, and rolling. Group 3 is Creating Civic Commons, facilitated by PSU Professor C.N.E. Corbin, focused on how our adapted streets must be more than just paid restaurant seating. You can discuss ways to promote stronger community ties and social connection through the design, programming, and use of space. Group 4 is art and placemaking, facilitated by Portland Creative Laureate Subhashini Ganesan. We're asking, what is the role of art and culture in planning, design, and activation in public space? You'll discuss ways for art to bring intrigue and reflection into unexpected places. And Group 5 is funding and stewardship, facilitated by Hao Hagedorn, Associate Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center at PSU. Once a public space is designed and built, there's a need to plan for how this space will be cared for on an ongoing basis. Portland lacks an organization and a structure devoted to public space stewardship. What does that ideal structure look like? Each of the breakout rooms will follow the same 3-question framework to guide your discussion. These questions are shown on the right. First, we'll daydream. What are the biggest opportunities in your topic area? What is a vision of the future that we should strive for in 5 years? Then we'll offer kind of a reality check. What are the biggest barriers to achieving success? Why haven't we done this already? And we'll finish with some next steps. What groups or people are working in this area and who should be included? Who and what is missing from the conversation? Welcome back, everybody. It looks like we're all coming back from our breakout rooms. I'm watching the numbers tick up as people rejoin our large group. So yes, welcome back from your breakout groups. I hope your discussion was engaging and informative. I hope you were able to share your questions or comments in the chat, in the discussion, in the Post-it note tool, because we want to be able to refer back to these notes and share what we've learned. So I want to just take a moment to kind of hear from our facilitators, just a sliver of what you discussed. I'm going to give each of our facilitators just a couple minutes to report back to the large group, to share kind of what the discussion explored, what you found most striking of the ideas, and you know, whatever you wanted to kind of bring back to the larger group in this wrap-up moment. So Julius, if you could start us out with a summary of what you all talked about in your group.
Yeah, there was a lot of really great discussions. I think something that that immediately stood out that I think sort of applied to all 3 aspects of what we're doing here. So the dream, but also addressed to the practicality and next steps, was mutual aid, which is something that has, you know, developed and that's kind of grown since the pandemic, and that also sort of intersects with this ability for us to, you know, meet people where they're at, right? There have been mutual aid networks that have expanded since the pandemic, and something that was discussed and brought up was, you know, we can piggyback off of what's already been there. Another thing that came up, and something that sort of just something I noticed, which tends to be like a problem like in Portland and in these spaces, was, you know, creating spaces that are actually inclusive to the conversation and allowing BIPOC folks to actually come to the table. So something that was said just at the very end was, you know, even the timing of this event is somewhat problematic because it falls smack dab in the middle of the workday. And, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that here we are having a discussion about global equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the majority of the folks in the conversation are white, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But what came out of that conversation, again, as a result, were folks talking about how they can be more open. And while that's a conducive and productive conversation in its own right, it still misses the way in which we actively meet folks where they are. And so the last thing I'll say that I think came up, which kind of sums up some of the other things, so sorry folks who said great things and I'm not mentioning here, was, you know, finding tangible ways to deal with sort of the realities of the historical legacy of inequality in Portland, racial inequality in Portland. So, you know, finding ways to address where, like, what past wrong, so not having green space, not having parks, and then also getting out of the way. So when folks do start to do new things, how we can help them by facilitating that further, but not being paternalistic in our approach, not thinking we know best. And when I'm saying we, it's those with wealth, power, money, right? Those who are here in this conversation, not the communities that we're actively attempting to support with that, right? And so that's things that came up for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Julius. Now we want to hear from Todd.
We had really good ideas come up and stayed a lot in the daydreaming before, but embedded in it were the reasons why a lot of these things, the challenges before them. So really wanting to, you know, I think a lot of the ideas were beginning with a premise of let's get quickly beyond businesses, right? It's not about healthy business permits, not privatization of public space, it's public space, and what does that mean? And in terms of shutting down streets for that use, thinking broader, engaging the community to do that, maybe thinking about road diets came up, as well as just thinking of partially shutting down streets and really being mindful about how that's done and thinking about that in inclusive ways. One thing that was great in our group is that we had people who were working with really specific ideas, really specific proposals that when you hear them, you think, yeah, absolutely, let's do that. But have found that, some of the barriers that have come up seems to, initially we heard things like a lack of consensus. Of course, money is always an issue. But as we're dreaming big, I think we already have a lot that we can leverage. We just heard from a couple ideas that are already happening, but we know that throughout the city, there are people with amazing ideas doing great proposals, and it's just a matter of bravely doing them.
Thank you, Todd. Professor Corbin, what did you have to share?
Oh, so I think one thing that we definitely wrestled with, especially under the idea of civic commons, is how even in the classical sense, if we think about the feudal system, that there's always a tug of war between public and privatization, and what does actually public mean, and how do communities have agency to actually change their streets to their desired needs. And so one of the topics that did come up is how are communities be able to have this agency and create their commons outside of business districts? Like, how does that look like at the neighborhood level? I think a lot of people are in support of a carless street system at some, in some degree, but we also have to understand that it is putting up barriers. And what does it mean when you shut down one part of the street, and what does that mean as far as access? I'm particularly thinking about frontline and essential workers, and how sometimes streets being shut down also means that they are having a longer, more laborious way of getting to their work. And I think that particularly targets Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian workers that tend to be the frontline workers under COVID. But I think one of the things is, and I think it was a really great point that was brought up, is that a lot of these tensions around how community wants get filtered through the municipality, through these agencies, and what does that mean to have that filter and not have direct agency, and what could that mean as far as technology, or there's a great post on like paid positions for common keepers, and like what would that mean, and how do we secure that that idea of the civic commons moving forward. So I think there's a lot of great conversations. I think people are very excited to see this, but I think there's also a little bit of how can we actually make this open for everybody, in which they can feel a belonging and feel dignity, and actually be full agents of these spaces that they seek in the city.
Thank you. Subhashini.
Thank you. We covered a lot of ground, I believe, and I'll start with, we had a series of questions that we started with, one of which was who's not here, who's not in this room, and I'd like to read a few of those thoughts. Frontline workers, families, Black Portlanders, children, political decision makers, houseless community, seniors, BIPOC, immigrants, refugees, people with disabilities, people representing Portland's many different neighborhoods, people without access to technology. So we kind of began with the privilege that we have to be in this room to have this discussion. And then we took it through those three questions with an added lens. So in question one, we added questions that related to what are words and phrases that you might use to describe creative placemaking. So we had many things like inclusiveness, welcoming a place to be, a place to engage, making a place meaningful and inclusive so it speaks to the community that lives right there and to all others who arrive or visit, color and multisensory experiences, incorporating nature into city as a form of art, people being excited to be in that space. So I assume everyone's going to get to see Jamboards because I'm just going to spend the next week, I think, just staring at them. And then the second question of the reality check, we added another lens of what does equity and accessibility mean to you? And several of the answers included fear of change. Biggest barrier is apathy and lack of understanding why all people need to be included in this planning process. Cultural engagement is key. Money, cost, ongoing stewardship, opportunities for everyone to be part of the creative process, subjective tastes and attitudes forced on public art. And then in the number 3, the next steps, we added another lens of how do we do creative placemaking in an equitable way. So bringing those 2 thoughts that we had at the beginning. And again, it relates to, I think, the question that we were thinking about at the beginning of who's not at the table. So empowering youth, break down disciplinary silos, make the process easy, don't get it too complicated. Landscape designers and architects encouraging artists, involving relevant groups. And there was a discussion about involving them at the get-go rather than plan and say, here, we're presenting this plan to you. What do you think about it? So I will leave it there. Really appreciate the community. We worked hard. I gave everybody a framework of can we do this together in relationship and evolve rigorous creative activation. So thank you. Team.
Thank you, Suba. Hao, you want to close this out?
Yeah, sure. So we spent a lot of time daydreaming because funding and stewardship, I think, is a really difficult piece of the equation in making these public spaces work. And so in daydreaming, a lot of the ideas fell in the realm of, can we partner with other existing programs? So for example, is there a way that we can work with parks in order to develop more pocket parks and plazas and these green spaces that are focused within the neighborhood? You know, the idea of partnering with youth organization and libraries to adopt plazas and just make it a space that feels welcoming to those of all ages and different sized communities. There was this thought of, you know, the healthy business program is great, but how do you create a vision for everybody to be an initiator of these programs and not just businesses? Can somebody who is just, you know, in their neighborhood activate their space with whatever idea? And so in order to do that, it needs to be sort of right size so that any regular person can pick it up and start with varying levels of commitment. And then reality hit, and I felt like this is where we became sort of bureaucratic. And so the reality of the fact that, you know, you can spark an idea with passion, but soon burnout is pretty common even in the business. So, you know, for example, even if you have sort of an anchor tenant, what happens when they move on to the next thing and decide that they no longer want to be a part of that business? Also, there's this concern that what if the actual use of the space does that match the intended use? And so does there need to be clarity on what the intent of the space is? And then just maintenance dollars, where does it come from? You know, even if we do partner with parks or other public agencies, they are also tapped for resources. And so we are all fighting for sort of that, you know, we are working in that scarcity model. So how do we move beyond the scarcity model? But we did leave but we did have some ideas for next steps. So, for example, Marnie Duke put out that the Metro RTO, the regional transportation options, they have some funding for light infrastructure. So if you have an idea, you can reach out to Marnie to seek out a grant for your idea. And then in the Brentwood neighborhood, there's a small group of folks who are called the Brentstock incubators. And so they, I think, are ready and passionate to take on neighborhood projects that improve the right-of-way spaces with urban habitat and green community spaces. So there are some small ideas that can ignite some of the some additional stewardship possibilities.
Thank you,
and I will
Hal.
leave it at that.
Thank you, Hal. Yeah, I know there's a lot to try to capture in a small report back. I just want to say thank you so much to all of our facilitators today. I was able to bounce around and listen into a few of the different breakout groups. I heard great conversation and comments and discussion in all of them. We're going to wrap up today's workshop with information for how to stay involved and what comes next. If you could load up the slides, Ellen, we can show people.
Yes, I shall.
One of the best ways for community to get involved in street transformation projects just over the last 10 years or so has been through a community group called Better Block PDX. Now they've got a new partnership with Portland State University, and Better Block PSU offers a pipeline to develop your own community-led ideas using student teams to develop the concepts, the engineering, to work through some of those details. They have an open request for project proposals that's active right now. And we want you to think about it. Think about submitting your own projects, connecting with your community and seeing if there's an idea you can submit to their response for proposals and get the process rolling. We'll post a link in the chat for you to follow up.
Well, some of you might be wondering, what are we going to do with all of this great stuff that we learned today? Well, for one thing, we're going to inform the work of projects that a bunch of students at PSU and the University of Oregon are going to be working on in collaboration with various community partners. And we would really love for other people who teach or who are doing research, whether it's at the college level or at high school level, if you think that there's an intersection between what you're working on and the themes that we've been addressing here, we'd love for you to engage with us and bring your classes in. We're going to be holding a workshop in April that'll be focused on these projects. We're just trying to get a date that works for all the different classes. So stay tuned for that. And this information hopefully will help, Hal and her colleagues develop some of these proposals they get for the Better Block projects. They're going to come in and they'll be, probably open for a lot of different suggestions. We certainly hope to inform PBOT's continuing experimentation in placemaking in public space. And I shouldn't limit that to PBOT, because I think one of the things that's come out of this is the need for, more coordination and collaboration between different agencies. And we will like to present it in a form that will be available for community members and practitioners, share it with people. And there will be a follow-up of after our April event, which is hopefully to generate brainstorming and build the collaborative process around these specific projects. We'll reconvene at the end of the spring, whether it's in late May or early June. We'll pin that date down and we'll share with everybody the findings of our various meetings, as well as discuss the work that's been done on the projects. And more, importantly, or equally importantly, talk about the next steps for the Urban Design Collaborative. and I've posted this link here, and it'll be posted in the chat. Until we get our website up, please get in touch with us through this feedback form. So again, as I said at the beginning, Urban Design Collaborative, we don't really exist yet. We are starting a conversation. This is the beginning. There were a lot of people who were not part of this conversation, who were not here today. What might we be? What might we do? Please join us. It's you don't have to be a designer to join this group. You just have to want to think creatively about the future of places, particularly important, but also beyond. And we're looking for your collective energy to help bring this group to life. So Nick did such a great job in moderating. I think we could bring it to an end here, unless there are any final comments that Nick, you or Hal or any of our other facilitators would like to share as a way of thanking everybody and saying goodbye until the next time.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for being such a great audience, and our facilitators for helping make this happen. We couldn't have done it without everyone here to make this discussion happen. So thank you so much.
I also wanted to thank everybody, but I also think that we need, one of the next steps is to bring together the folks whose voices have not been heard. And so I think that is a specific next step that we will try to make happen.
But we can't do that alone. So we invite all of you to help us reach the people that need to be reached.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Hope to see you in April.